I think it's better if we start because today's lecture will be quite long. We will have to discuss the 19th century architecture. Last week we discussed we discussed the architecture of the Enlightenment. We discussed the visionary architecture of Boulez, Ledoux, and Lepure. You remember that? And what was the point behind the lecture? The idea was that these architects, Piranesi, Boulez, and Ledoux, they introduced to architecture a very clear stance of a case that architecture is more like offering us visionary ideas, some big ideas about architecture, about its nature, and some ideas how architecture could be related to culture. So these architects were less concerned, Boulez and Piranesi, with probably we can say that they were less concerned with technological aspects of architecture, with the idea that architecture is just a poetry of construction. So they were more like trying to achieve what they would try to. So we said that these architects should be respected as great visionaries, and in a sense we are these ideals of inventing architecture out of our own imagination is something that we appreciate even today. So the one point was that this is why we appreciate the architecture of the visionaries. And the other point was that Boulez and Ledoux, they were the first architects probably who suggested that simple geometric shapes could be a way to a new language of architecture, to a renewed language of architecture. But of course, we also saw that Ledoux, for example, experimented with these abstract shapes that we don't really find in history of architecture. If we find simple shapes in previous history of architecture, they are more result of construction and of adhering to local building traditions and climate. So yes, in history of architecture, we can see many simple shapes, many pure shapes. But what we believe is that the pure geometry was never an ideal for the architects, for the master builders of the far past. And so what my point was that I think for the first time we see the emergence of an individual architect who idealizes the pure geometry. And this is what we will see in 20th century architecture as well. From aesthetic point of view, we see the modern architects of the early 20th century idealize the simplicity of forms and the purity and geometrical purity of architectural expression. And another important aspect of these theoreticians we discussed the theories of Logier, was the idea of truthfulness to the basic idea of architecture, which for Logier was a primitive hut. So he was very critical of Baroque architecture, which used architectural elements of classical orders as signs. So these elements had the role of signs. So the column was a sign of the column rather than a true column. So these were the basic ideas we discussed for 19th century architecture, for the beginning of the 19th century. And we said that in 19th century we see what happens. And I even said for the last lecture that 19th century was less exciting, at least for me. From cultural point of view, we see, of course, huge transformations, but these transformations are more result of technological progress and industrial revolution. And paradoxically, we do not see these kind of visionaries as Ledoux and Boulez, who could imagine the very impossible, the world totally renewed. So let's start our introduction to our 19th century architecture, which I titled Controversies, because we have it's very hard to make sense of this 19th century architecture. I think this is the first century where we have very many strands of architectural thinking, and we cannot really tell one single story of the 19th century, especially in Europe. So why I included these slides in this presentation? I wanted to remind you how we arrived at 19th century, and how important classical antiquity has become since Renaissance for the European architecture. So the language, so we can say that what the Greeks created was not a construction technique or technology of architecture, rather it was a language of architecture. And this language of architecture of the orders is maintained throughout European history, throughout all these ages. So we see the change of styles, the change of interpretations, but as if the basic grammar is still the same, that some basic syntactic elements are intact. And so this is one fascinating thing about the heritage of Greek architecture, and how European architecture tried to inherit this language. Of course, and this is why our lectures are usually centered around Europe, because it's easier to tell a coherent story. So here, look at our timeline. I'm trying to tell a huge coherent story starting from 800 BCE up to almost 900 and even 20th century, as if it is one giant story of the language of classical architecture which survives. And so it's more comfortable to tell us a coherent story of architecture, even though you should be very critical of such a position, because you know that, like, for example, we exclude many things here. For example, I even excluded Egyptian architecture and early Mesopotamian architecture. We exclude Aztec and Mayan architecture. We exclude architecture of the Far East, Chinese, Indian architecture, vernacular architecture of Africa, and many more, and even some vernacular architecture of European countries. So all of this is in the name of creating a coherent narrative, and this narrative is the only basis to create a discourse on architecture. Because one thing is the building traditions, and people have been building according to nature for centuries. But what we see here is why I think this is important, because here we see kind of a discourse on what architecture is, and I think this is the only tradition, as far as I'm aware, where we have a discourse on architecture, not just a building tradition, but discourse. And we can say that there is no architecture without its discursive part. If we don't talk about it, there is no architecture. There is just a building art of building. Architecture is kind of a emerges as soon as we start to think it. And so let's go through with our story from our ancient Greece to Romans, whose main invention was the arch, and the concrete also allowed them to build huge domes, as in Pantheon you see here. But as you see, the Romans took the Greek orders and added and enriched the language of Greek architecture in many ways. And finally, in around 40 BC, we see Vitruvius one of the first evidence, or probably there have been many other treatises on architecture, but this is one complete surviving work. So this is why we think that this is why this architecture centered on the Greek traditions is so important for us, because we have intellectuals speaking about it, and the fact of speaking about things changes the things and defines the things. So the things exist in themselves, but as soon as we attach words to the things, everything changes. The whole nature of the thing changes. And so we see the first how Vitruvius elaborates his ideas about origins of architecture. He also gives us advices, specific instructions, how to build, what technologies to use, and also he was the first one to give us the grammar rules of how to create these different orders and what rules to follow to build, to construct those. And of course, we see the emergence of other typologies in Rome, as you remember from last lecture, from last semester. I'm sure you remember. So let's go quickly through it. The one exception here, and I even put asterisks there in our timeline, is the emergence of Gothic architecture. Like as if like a small anomaly in history of Western architecture, and it was indeed, as we will see later, regarded as a kind of a barbaric art, and this is why the people in Renaissance started calling it Gothic, or like incomprehensible architecture, because it did not follow the mathematical and ideals and mathematical and architectural ideals of the Greeks. What the Gothic cathedrals seemed to follow was this the idea of resisting gravity through a very innovative methods. And even so, it seems that the people in the Renaissance did not really appreciate the idea that you could resist gravity through a skeleton, and the skeleton itself becomes an object of beauty. And so so this chapter in Western architecture becomes very, very important for 19th century theoreticians, and we'll see why. But then, of course, Renaissance is ushered in, and the grammar of Greek architecture is reuptaken, and continued and elaborated further and further. And now we see new and new theoreticians writing about the orders, the importance of orders, and trying to reconstruct what's the genuine or true orders that the Greeks should have used. Even though now we know that all of the theoreticians of the Renaissance, they created their own orders, they did not really reconstruct the true order system, because actually there was no true order system in Greece. Every temple in Greece employed its own slight variations of proportions. So let's go through the Renaissance, and here we see in Renaissance, I think for the first time, the idea that the column, for example, has a much more important function. Its function is a communicative function rather than a function of a support. So as if the element which began its life as a thing that supports the building suddenly becomes a device to communicate the idea of a support. So it becomes a sign. And so now you are invited to read the facade of a building as a structural entity. So even though, for example, in this Alberti's Palazzo Rucellai, we see that basically it is the wall that supports the structure, but Alberti tries to communicate as the idea that it is not just a wall, but that there is a structure and structural idea behind the wall. And to communicate the idea of a structure, he uses all these articulations. So this is what we call articulations, or on the facade. And so I think this was one of the first examples of how architecture becomes a very different kind of sign. because we see, we have witnessed in past histories of architecture that when we say that architecture is a sign or a symbol, we think of that architecture should express some external ideas, right? A pyramid expresses the idea of a sun, how the pharaoh should rise towards the sun, or the ziggurat expresses the whole symbolic mythology of the Mesopotamian people. So we are used to such symbols and such signs, but these kind of symbols are more like words that come together to form phrases, sentences, and the phrases and sentences have underlying grammar. So these kind of signs don't communicate some external ideas that are outside architecture, because look, so the idea that a building represents a sun, or that a bridge represents peace, like you remember the bridge in Tbilisi, the Peace Bridge it is called, or that the parliament building in Kutaisi represents transparent democracy or bubble. This is one very simple model of symbolism. But here we have a different kind of signs. These signs are more like particles which come together to form complex statements, and the contents of these statements are purely architectural. So architecture expresses its own self. Of course, when we can interpret these buildings as a power, as a message that how powerful the Rucellai family was, and so on and so forth. But more important thing is that architecture becomes a kind of a sign, a language with its own internal rules of grammar. So the idea of this grammar was further, I think, elaborated by Andrea Palladio, who introduces the typology of villas, and I believe you studied this the last semester, so I won't stop here. So we see how Palladio employs some very, very basic schemes, and we'll see Palladio's plans further down in our presentation. And so as if Palladio takes a very, some simple grammatical structure, like a verb, noun, object, like in language we have, and using this primal structure, he can come up with thousands of variations for an ideal villa. So Andrea Palladio, of course, probably one of the most important theoreticians and practitioners of architecture, with his Quattro Libri, or the 4 books on architecture. And now it is often believed that it was, so all these architects still, I think, stayed truthful to some ideas of simplicity, of ideas of honesty for architecture. But it is believed that Michelangelo, when making this Medici vestibule, changed some attitudes towards this classical heritage, and these are the beginnings of what we call Baroque architecture. In Baroque architecture, we see much more theatrical gestures from the part of architecture. And as you remember from last lecture, this is what Logier was so critical of. So here we see architecture becoming a pure, we could interpret it as architecture becoming a sculptural spectacle. And I think, well, it's really not, so understanding Baroque requires more insight and more depth, and I hope last semester you had a deeper insight into Baroque, but let's simplify the idea of the Baroque with this building of Palazzo Te. I think this is almost a grotesque interpretation of orders. So here on the right we see the idea of the orders, and here we see how Giulio Romano interprets the idea that look, some stones are as if falling down, and some so we see the hint that the wall is kind of like more like a part decoration, partly theatrical decoration, partly reality, and it tries to play with us. So it becomes more and more playful, and this is one of the hallmarks of Baroque. And as Baroque evolves, we see how this basic grammar of the Greek architecture, which is represented here, suddenly changes into a total free play. it's like you take basic grammatical rules and then you leave the rules, some basic rules, but it is overtaken by pure imagination, pure whimsy, even whimsical, as the English like to say. So this is what precedes our 19th century, and as you remember, this is what precedes the architecture of the Enlightenment or the architecture of the visionaries. And so we come to this important building from Jacques-Germain Soufflot, who stands in a very stark contrast. Let's compare the buildings from previous century and this one. Like we see as if some return to certain honesty, where the column has returned as an actual supporting element, and it tried to return to the clarity of the original Greek architecture. And as you remember from the last lecture, this is what we start with, what we call neoclassicism. So, and we said that Ledoux was also one of the architects who elaborated neoclassicism, and so he is considered neoclassicist. And I'll remind you some of his works of Ledoux. So on the left, we see Ledoux's neoclassical essays on architecture. And what it gave rise to in 19th century is the whole strand of neoclassicism, which became an official style or the official architecture. Like if you went to academia to study architecture, this is what you would study. You would study the ideals of Greek architecture and apply the rules of neoclassicism to come up with the building. So we can also call this architecture slowly an academism in architecture. And academism in art and architecture is often associated with conservatism, with the adherence to values that sometimes are not very adequate to the reality, to the given reality. So it seems that the 19th century in general chooses the 19th century architects are attached to the idea of academism, but we saw the other side of Ledoux, this pure inventiveness of Ledoux, using of pure geometry as a basis of architecture. And we see that 19th century does not pick up this idea from Ledoux. So we see that the left path is what we see that the architects follow left path, and they don't follow the visions of Ledoux, Lecu, and Boulet. And it might not even be surprising, because such things, they were unimaginable how to build, and nobody built. And we see this loss in faith of architectural image, of big architectural ideas in 19th century. 19th century becomes the age of a more realistic, a more realism in a sense, more strive towards scientism, trying to understand history. So the history one was one of the more important topics of the whole century, of the whole 19th century. So when some kind of historic accuracy, scientific accuracy was more important than pure imagination, like we see with Ledoux. And so we begin our 19th century with neoclassicism. And when we say neoclassicism, it's very easily recognizable. We see how the portico or the entrances, you usually see symmetry. We usually see the elaboration of the entrance with detached columns, as if we take a Greek temple for entrance, and then behind it there is a big box attached to it. So this becomes kind of a basic formula of neoclassicism, and so we can see neoclassical buildings in everywhere, all over the world, because neoclassical architecture kind of becomes the first global language of architecture. Well, it becomes the global language of architecture because of colonization. So Georgia was colonized by Russia, and Russia adopted European ideals. So this architecture spread in Georgia. And so this is our National Museum on Freedom Square, on Liberty Square. Or we can see that even the colonizers themselves use neoclassical architecture for buildings that are supposed to express governmentality or some kind of nobility of governance, like the White House building is also a neoclassical building. In Germany, we also see the further elaboration of neoclassicism coupled with the philosophy of romanticism. So this is a very important aspect of that period, that neoclassical romanticism becomes the dominant form of architecture. Now, why we call it academism as well? Because the most famous school at that time, starting from almost 2 centuries ago, was the Académie des Beaux-Arts, this is how it is pronounced, or the Academy of Fine Arts in Paris. So this was the school where you would go to study through architecture. And so the architects who would work for important projects all around the world were raised in the French Academy, or they would be raised by the masters who were raised in the French Academy. So the Academy was this official, almost the center of this neoclassical thinking in architecture. And we see that starting from, of course, Paris, we have many examples of neoclassical architecture, and in USA and all over the world, in Latin America and so on and so on. But and we see this, but with academism, we see these fantasies going further and further. And like I always look with fascination at the plan on my right. I mean, if you after the lecture, please, we can find this plan online. I will give you this plan. And what is amazing about this plan is how many spaces you can create with simple columns and walls. And all these labyrinthine sequences of spaces gives us the magic of architecture, that you can wander through these halls endlessly, even on plan. So I think that imagination was not lost in this art, even though the facades of these buildings are very kind of even predictable. You kind of know what to expect from a neoclassical architecture, but it also gave us some new ideas of architecture arranged as a huge labyrinth as well. This is one example of a plan I have. I'm not really aware if we have other kinds of these kinds of examples in neoclassical architecture in this school. So as I said, in neoclassical architecture, one important strand is this romantic neoclassicism, which was followed by Carl Friedrich Schenkel. And this is a very important architect for our course, so please pay attention to this architect and find further information about this architect online, who creates this. We can say that Schinkel continues the formal aspects that Boulez and Ledoux started. So we see we saw earlier that Ledoux already established some basic formal rules for neoclassical architecture, and it seems that for Schinkel these formal ideas become kind of a ground to build up his own architecture. So he follows the line of probably Ledoux. We can say it, we can interpret this way. But then there is another strand of neoclassicism, and this other strand of neoclassicism follows the ideas of Laugier and Blondel. So you remember what Laugier was all about, right? Laugier's idea was the truthfulness in architecture, that the structure should be allowed to function as a pure structure, and it does not need further elaboration as a facade. And now we might be surprised to look at this building and say, why is this idea related to Laugier's ideas? So this is Henri Labrouste, but well, first, if we look at the facade and we see these arches, I think this time we get the clear idea that these arches are true arches. They are actually there to support the roof of the building. And we can even guess that behind those arches there is a complex vaulting system. And so even though this building might not look that special from the outside, a trained eye of an architect will see that it is much more structural rather than formal. So this one is more formal. It follows the formal ideals, like the formal ideals of a Greek temple, with its clear delineation of walls and columns. But here, it follows the honesty of structure. And this is André Labrouste, and if you look inside, and on the right side, you see the interior of this building, of this library Saint-Geneviève in Paris. And as you can see, it really is a pure structure. And another thing you might notice is that Henri Labrouste is the one who uses here the cast iron, or it might be a wrought iron. I'm sorry if I mix it up. So Saint-Geneviève Library becomes a new paradigm for 19th century architecture. And this paradigm, they start calling it structural neoclassicism or even rationalism. So Henri Labrouste becomes the seminal figure for 19th century architecture. So I did this slide just shows a comparison between the two ideas of Boulez, how Boulez imagines his library and how Labrouste imagines his library. So Boulez, let's see if somebody wants. Okay, so we see that Boulez library follows the idea of a pantheon, whereas so for Boulez, I think it is more important to create something grandiose, that follows some epicness of Roman and that recalls us the Roman, the immense spaces of Roman architecture. Whereas Labrouste just works with the basic ideas of structure and what iron structure can do, iron structural elements can do. And let's look at some other details of Saint-Geneviève Library, and we might be convinced. And I think you might already say that this building is almost modern. Wouldn't you agree? Here we still say that this building is rooted in ancient Greece, and it follows the ideals of Greece, of the architecture of Greco-Roman architecture. But suddenly we see a beautiful architecture that does not follow the idea of a column as a symbol of the mathematical order, especially in the interior. It uses the new materials to achieve beauty. And so this building, built in 1840, there's something very, very modern about it, isn't there? Of course, on the facade, we still see the classical, signs of classical architecture, but these signs serve to support this message that this is a structural building. It follows the ideals of structure. And so another, and the reading hall of this National Library, again, becomes the first time we see the strive for lightness. And we will see that for 20th century architecture, the idea of lightness, of reducing the mass, visual mass, and the actual mass of the building becomes one of the most important challenges and tasks, and even the ideals. A simple, lightweight, and filled with natural sunlight. And so I think in Labrouste's, of course, these the details themselves are too elaborate for our contemporary taste in simplicity and simple pure walls, but the basic ideas are already there of the modern architecture. Okay. So this was the library of Saint-Geneviève, and this is another library by Labrouste, which is called National Library. Now, the building on the outside is not that remarkable because it's a huge complex, and Labrouste built only this reading hall and some parts of this huge library. And if we and another very interesting part of this library is this this room, archival room, done almost completely out of metal frames, and which becomes almost so, I mean, you could it's almost unbelievable that the building is almost 2 centuries old, or 150 years old. So this is how we arrive in 19th century. We have this idea of classicism, but at the same time we see the arrival of the new materials, and architects see the possibilities of these new materials. So our today's lecture is a bit long, might be too long. We might do half today and another half next time if you get too tired, because we have to talk about the 19th century. The first thing we'll have to try to understand is the idea of new materials that arise in 19th century. Then another important process in the process of industrialization, and the industrialization of work leads to shift in how populations live and occupy the land. So the industrialization brought the demand for workforce in factories, and less people are required to work on the farmlands, and we see the growth, a chaotic growth of the cities. And we see how the global populations across Europe especially start moving away from the traditional farms and villages towards the cities and towns, what we call urbanization. And the process of urbanization is the process that is taking place even today as we speak. And we expect that in the next decades, even more and more people will be living in cities. So this is already our modern times. In 19th century shows the same problems that we face even today. So we see the rise of industrialization. So the one point was how to respond to this coldness of technology, to this anonymity of technology. So this was one concern from the side of architects. And we'll discuss how they faced the new technology, how architects try to soften the new technologies and to humanize the iron structures. Another strand will be this structural thinking in Europe, like thinking about on the nature of materials, of the new materials, to come up with a new architecture in Europe, and how all these two contributed to the emergence of a new language in architecture, which died in almost a decade. So the idea that the building must be structural, using new materials, but also welcoming to the larger audiences and employing the imagery of nature to convince us that iron is a beautiful thing. And this is, I think, the hallmarks of Art Nouveau. So this is one thing we'll have to discuss. And then we have the structural thinking in the USA, of what we call Chicago School. But today's lecture, I don't think Chicago School will be for the next time. We'll discuss Chicago School next time. Today we'll focus mostly on Europe. So, so the first is the industrialization or the Industrial Revolution. And the three inventions contributed to this Industrial Revolution. Of course, people have been working with iron for a long time, but everything changes when James Watt invents his steam engine, this effective with a huge that works very efficiently. Another invention was the Abraham Darby's furnace for smelting iron ore to purify it even further and to get a better grade iron compound. And then we have John Wilkinson's boring machine, which helped increase the iron ore production in Britain. So as you can see, all of these inventors are from Britain. And Abraham Darby was the first giant for iron manufacturing. And we see Darby's Iron Works, where the iron ore was smelted. And we can see this image, this painting, I think, shows a very important aspect. It shows as if like the new world is being born. We see the night sky illuminated by huge fires smelting ore. And we can easily say that this is the beginning, the creation of a new world out of the furnace where the ore is smelted in a revolutionary way, which will change forever the history of our planet. And of course, and it brings the rise of steam machinery and the new ways of transportation and the new ways of production, of mass production, which ultimately leads to mass consumption starting from 19th century. So industrialization changes the world anew. So it basically is an invention of a whole new world. And so for architecture, what becomes important is so we saw with Henri Labrouste the iron structures, but Henri Labrouste was almost a century later. We see the first usage of iron in construction, a cast iron bridge in Coalbrookdale in 1779. Now, please mind that this is the exact same time where Ledoux and Boulez are drawing their formal inventions and where Piranesi is drawing his imaginary prisons. But on the other side of the planet, we see the application of the new technologies to build some more efficient structures. And so this bridge was only 30 meters long. This bridge is located near the Darby's, near this place, Darby's Iron Works. This was one of the first, basically the first iron bridge in history. And it was, not surprisingly, it overused the materials. It was not as effective. The engineer could have used less iron to produce this span. And this is what the engineers realized very soon. And Thomas Telford becomes one of the most important engineers of 19th century. Now his bridge uses a similar principle, but with much more efficacy. It uses 3 times, if I remember, less material than the first bridge. Now the iron has already been used by architects, but it was not used as an element of architecture. It was used rather an element of a support structure, like for example in this Victor Louis French Theater, which is located in Versailles. We see that the roof is supported by metal trusses, but architecture itself is purely follows Renaissance ideals or the ideas of the royal architecture. Another interesting example of iron architecture is this Hall Oblé that is translated as the Hall of the Grain. It was a market, a closed market in Paris. So we see that the huge dome is created out of the metal structure almost a century later, actually, no, almost 50 years later from this bridge, from Coalbrookdale Bridge. Why is this building important? Because as they say here, architect did his own job. So the architect elaborated the basic shape of the building, but the engineer made it possible. So this is considered the first examples where we see the clear division between the two tasks, between the two jobs of architect and engineer. Because as you remember in Gothic architecture, in Roman architecture, the architect was the master builder. He was the sole responsible for everything. He was the main overseer of the whole building processes. And soon we see iron bridges all over the cities of Europe. For example, the very first bridge, iron bridge in Paris, was this bridge Pont des Arts, the famous bridge. And of course, United States didn't fall behind, and a very important figure for United States becomes James Finlay, who I think was the first one to elaborate a suspense bridge. So Finlay's contribution was the application of this new iron technology for suspense bridges. Now, today we won't discuss the details of how these structures worked. I think you kind of get the idea what is the basic principle behind these structures. And in Britain, it was Thomas Telford, as we said, who achieved amazing results. Like we see the bridge, 177 meters long, over Menai Straits, again using suspension bridges. And mind, this is 1825 now, and so almost 2 centuries ago, the bridge building achieved its pinnacles, if we can even say this. Okay, let's go further. And so again, in United States, John Roebling, the famous, became famous building this iconic Brooklyn Bridge, but also the Niagara Falls Bridge. And here he used a very complex system where the deck itself becomes some supportive element. And so let's go quickly over this. And we see the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge, of the famous and iconic Brooklyn Bridge. And Saltash Viaduct also, I didn't write the name of the engineer here, is also another innovative usage. And we see how engineers already understand how the tensile strength of the material they are using, and they're applying scientific methods to come up with the most effective shapes for these structures. Now, architects kind of fall behind. Architects still can't use all of this knowledge to build something totally different as yet. Well, what architects do, they kind of use metal, iron, or rather what we call cast iron. Now, cast iron has a bigger concentration of carbon, so it is not as strong as steel. It can be used for some simple support structures, and we see the rise of cast iron, usage of cast iron. And architects, as you can see, they take the basic ideas of Greek architecture and reinterpret it in iron. And so we see the very, very interesting evolution of this Greek architecture, because originally we believe that the Greek architecture began by wood. So all the elements of Greek architecture originally were produced in wood. And then the Greek masters translated the ideas of the wooden architecture into stone architecture. And now we see 19th century, this original wooden architecture translated into stone architecture, translated into iron architecture, cast iron architecture. For example, in the United States, we see these famous facades of New York. This is not stone, this is cast iron decorative columns. Okay? This is how architects first started employing cast iron. Instead of making something revolutionary, the first one was probably using architecture to speak the same language as the stone architecture. But of course, it's not quite totally true, because we see the first, so here again, we see these cast iron facades in United States. And if I remember correctly, this is one of the first buildings, again, to employ cast iron as a support element, as an inside structural elements. Another important building from this period, from United States, is this Ho-Walt building. Sorry for the pronunciation, in 1859. And this building is important for history of construction, at least, because it was the first building where Elisha Otis implemented his new invention, the lift, the elevator. And we know it was the invention of the elevator, and then a further refinement of iron structures that allows skyscrapers to rise. But in Europe, well, in Europe we see the employment of iron, but in a very peculiar fashion. It seems that for this technical part of a building, which is a large assembly hall in a Gare de l'Est, or the East Station in Paris, the famous East Station of Paris, we see that the iron is exposed and used honestly for this technical hall where you wait for the train to arrive. But on the outside, this building looks quite different, right? It follows some interpretation of classical and Roman architecture. And so with this, we see this weird split that we can use metalworks for functional purposes for these industrial areas, but the city should not have this look of a metal of a city filled with metallic monsters. Okay? And this is one of the greatest examples of this. This is the same building. This is the famous St. Pancras station in London. And look, inside the architect employs boldly the iron structures. But look, this huge hall is surrounded by a neo-Gothic building. So it is hidden away from the face of the city. And if you go, and now we don't have time, but you can go to Google Maps and look at the 3D model of this building. And it is a very peculiar building. So how the architect tries to create architectural face for an industrial building. And this is what we mean when we say that 19th century follows the ideals of, tries to get inspired by history of architecture and not by technology at some stages. So that there will be two strands of modern architecture. So here we see that the architects are still inspired by history of architecture rather than by the new emerging technologies of iron and then later concrete. Okay, so I hope, let's go to the next example is this Crystal Palace, and you might say, wow, here we see glass and iron in 1845, almost 2 centuries ago. But what we must say that this is not, in a sense, a building. It is more like a giant glass house, a palm house, the famous palm house in Kew Gardens. And so here, it's hard to, it was more like a functional structure to house the indoor plants. And maybe people back then didn't really think about it in an architectural terms, about this structure. But this is the first structure which honestly employs metal and glass to create huge stands, which we are very used to in the 20th century. But the next building by John Paxton, the famous Crystal Palace, already had something architectural about it. Right? It's called a palace now. It is not just a glass house. So the glass house was built for exhibition in 1851 by Joseph Paxton, who was an engineer and a gardener. He was not himself an architect, so he was not really concerned about architectural ideas. And let's see inside the Crystal Palace. We see these huge, enormous spaces filled with sunlight and greenery. And one of the amazing buildings of the 19th century, which we might call modern. But one thing important about Joseph Paxton was that his contribution was not the shape of the building or the idea of the building, but rather he created a very effective system of construction. So his true genius was that this whole thing could be built in a couple of months. And this was his true achievement. The idea of how he can assemble very quickly such a complex building with using these industrial materials. And this was the true achievement. So I think this is the first time where we have to judge the building not according to its looks, because honestly it looks kind of not that inspiring from the outside. It looks even kind of boring or even controversial. Well, in the interiors are really impressive, filled with sunlight, and something that people had probably never seen before in their lifetime. But the true achievement was this whole process. So the idea of this metal architecture, this giant iron skeleton architecture, continues throughout second half of 19th century. And the one important thing is this Paris World Fair. And the idea of World Fairs is also becomes very interesting for us. And the architecture of the fairs, I think, is one lecture that we might do one day. Because what is a fair? It is a exhibition space where architecture does not really serve any particular needs. Architecture is there to be exhibited and to exhibit. So it is like this ephemeral imaginary land, the fairs. And so we see the rise of fairs all over, especially in Europe. And this was the London Fair, and this is the Paris Fair. And in Paris, and then the Fair of Paris, we see this very particular building called Gallery of the Machines. What is interesting here? The machine becomes the object of curiosity, of adoration, of fascination, something worth exhibiting and inspecting and contemplating. So we see these fetishes of the machines, even almost like a century and a half ago, with this huge building that was dedicated to machines, like a temple of machines. So this is how this building probably looked from the inside. You see the engineers, and you see this huge gallery where you cross and where you walk around and look at the whole the new inventions. And architecturally, what is important here? We see again what we call in architecture the span, this huge span without any further additional supports. So this was the achievement of the Gallery of Machines, achieving this huge span, roof span, or what we say. Now the next Gallery of Machines was, this one was from 1867, and this one is from 1889. This is the most famous Paris fairs, and we'll see why this is the most famous. We see another Gallery of the Machines here. Now the art of making huge structures out of iron reaches its pinnacle in 19th century. Now the span of this structure, as you can see, is enormous. I think and never seen before in the history of architecture. So it surpasses every other giant roofed space that has ever been created, and it is with the help of the new materials that this could be achieved. Now the interior of this Gallery of Machines is also very interesting. What do you see in this picture? In this picture, you see the society of leisure. Like a century ago, like if it was 1789 instead of 1818, right? These people would be working in farm with their hands, fighting for survival. But now we see them standing on this platform that moves around and solving the most important problem of the industrial society: what to do with the free time, how to employ the free time, and how to spend meaningfully the free time. And so we see the rise of the leisure society, the society later of the spectacle. And look at this huge, interesting, so this Gallery of Machines was the machine itself, because it had, so I think it was one of the first times where the building had these moving parts. And it was like a big, itself like a big machine, not just a shell that housed machines, but itself a machine. And we see these fascinating images from this, from the Gallery of Machines. Uh, is this architecture? Well, this is partly architecture, partly engineering, so it's still hard to decide. But we see that this architecture was still employed in these temporary structures, in these structures for spectacular, to show something. And the architecture was, this kind of structures were still not accepted for museums or other types of buildings. Okay, let's. Now, why was this exhibition important? Because here, Gustav Eiffel did his most famous work. Gustav Eiffel, again, very important engineer from 19th century. He had his own share of inventions and mathematical elaboration of the possibilities of these structures. So we won't go further here, but Eiffel's bridges stand out as a step further in the evolution of iron bridges. But of course, he is most famous for this for the 1889 exhibition with his Eiffel Tower, with his huge tower, which has a very fascinating nature. Like from the outside, it still follows the ideals of classical architecture. We see the base, the body, and then the head, and we see how the elevation is articulated. So it is a curious object. It is an engineered object, but which follows some basic rules of architecture. And we see these cornices and this anthropomorphic things in Eiffel's Tower. So it is a very interesting structure, possessing a very interesting architectural qualities. But of course, it is on the inside that the magic happens, with all these lattices, iron lattices, moving elevators that brought people to unprecedented spots and spaces. And what is curious, that the building itself has no actual function, and this is another thing we can reflect upon. And so this structure devoid of function still manages to become the heart of the city. And how the void can become the center is a very interesting topic, which we won't discuss today. So this is one aspect of 19th century architecture, the the introduction of cast iron and wrought iron. Another achievement and another emerging technology of 19th century architecture is the concrete. Well, of course, you remember that concrete was the invention of Roman architects, but they used a concrete is a mixture of stones and pebbles of different sizes that are bound together by some material that can bind these together. So what the Romans used, they used volcanic ash and other materials to bind so cement is the binding material. So of course Romans didn't use the modern cement. They used volcanic ash to bind the stones together. So their concrete was a very strong material, but a very different kind of material. And with this material, you remember that Romans achieved a true miracle, creating one of the huge, enormous dome of the Pantheon, which was the biggest covered space throughout thousands of years until Renaissance and later times. Now, the true invention, the new concrete, comes about with the discovery of the Portland cement. I even wrote here some basic composition of the Portland cement. And Joseph Espin was the first one to patent this Portland cement. That has a much more peculiar characteristics. And this gives rise to the modern concrete. The concrete that we use today, its binding material is Portland cement. And so we see the usage of concrete in modern times for the construction of, for example, lighthouses and other. But another step forward okay, one thing is concrete. That's one thing. But the weakness of concrete is that it can be compressed and it can support the compressing forces, but it cannot, if you try to stretch it, it will break. So you know this, probably you already studied this in a structure class, that if you try to put weight on the horizontal bar of concrete, it will definitely break from the bottom part. So you need to strengthen the material, concrete, with something. And Joseph Monnier, who was a gardener and who used concrete for pottery and not for construction, he came up with a way to making a concrete mixture stronger by incorporating this metal grid inside the form. And so this gave the structure the ability to withstand bending forces and stretching as well. So the metal grid allowed it to stretch, and the concrete allowed it to withstand compression. And Joseph Monnier is credited with creating the armed reinforced, what we say today is reinforced concrete, although he did not use it in construction. The first, Francois Poignet became the first one to employ concrete in civil construction. And we see this building, his own house, is remarkable because it is the first house built out of concrete, although the facade and the plan does not really tell us anything about it. Now we know that concrete has some very unique qualities, and you can build something that is unimaginable to build with wood, iron, and other materials. But of course, Poignet built his concrete with his house, which followed the very traditional ideas of architecture. Another huge step in concrete was François Hennebic, who was the first one to employ this idea of reinforced concrete and specifically show what kind of construction we can achieve and how to achieve, how to use concrete in construction. And this is the first image in history of construction or architecture where we see reinforced concrete with bars and beams and column system. So you see this image is almost older, almost a century and even older. So in a big system started becoming, so basically he's the inventor of the modern construction technique. And Hennebic was a very it seems he was a quite eccentric person, because this is the house he built for himself out of concrete. And we see somehow how concrete is used to create these corbelling elements. But his house is quite eccentric. He built kind of a mini minaret on his house, and I don't really know why his house was so eccentric. But again, this house can be has this significance. Now we'll see later that, like already in 1894, the concrete, it was actually called Anatole de Baudot, an architect, employed not reinforced concrete, but reinforced beton, as he called. Now there's a difference between reinforced concrete and reinforced beton. This one used not metal, but other type, like bricks to reinforce, bricks and concrete to create structures. And we'll return to this example, but which is the first example of sacred architecture employing concrete. Okay, so this is Anatole de Baudot, an important architect in our history. Okay, let's go. Now, now we see that already by the middle of the 18th century, the world changing. And it is not just technology, but the technology changes the whole structure of the society. And even today, we are witnessing the same thing, how technology, like our mobile technologies, are changing the way we relate to each other and how we value things. So the problem of how the technology is changing the society from the ground up becomes very important from the 19th century onwards. And the questions of justice, of social equality, already become apparent that technology might create some very difficult divisions in society. And so we see in even 19th century the first critics of technology arising. So we see kind of this negative response to this technocratic and materialistic century, 19th century, which technology is bringing up. And this was the technological. What we discussed was the technologies of the 19th century and what they brought to architecture, to engineering rather. Now the response from the intellectuals to the question of technology. And one important personality here is Augustus Pugin, and I would invite you to look further into his writings, into his ideas. Well, Pugin looked at his contemporary Britain, England, and he saw the many vices of the modern times. And I think this is the first time that people realize that they're living in the modernity, in a sense that modernity was something that is ever that tomorrow things will be even more different, and that in the past things were different. Today, so the idea that the time brings fundamental change becomes more and more apparent, which was not such apparent in Middle Ages. Like in Middle Age, this famous example is that you could be born in a world moved by horses, and you could, and by the age you were 60, you would live in a world where you could fly planes. You see how quickly things change. Your childhood, you spend a childhood among horse carriages, but around the age of 60, you can now fly over the Atlantic Ocean. And even today, like even me, I was raised in a technology, in a TV era where TV was everywhere, and now suddenly internet becomes everyday triviality. So this idea of modernity comes up, and Pugin compares in his famous book, which is called Contrasts, the Middle Ages, or these Gothic Middle Ages, with his contemporary culture. And he presents us with the contrasting images of Gothic architecture and modern architecture. And he saw in Gothic or in Middle Ages some very important things that are missing from contemporary society. For example, he says that, like, for example, the life of a poor man in Middle Ages and the life of a poor man in the industrial society. And on the right, you see this contrast. He says that in contemporary society, the poor man is destined to imprisonment, and then he will die. This is the prison he drew, the prison cell. And then when he dies, his body will be disposed of and thrown in somewhere. But in Middle Ages, the poor man's house was a monastery where he was part of a community. And when he died, he would be given a decent burial, and his name would be remembered and mentioned. And so he slowly starts to idealize the whole society of the Middle Ages, pre-industrial society, let's say so. And this is why he shows this contrast between the Gothic architecture and the modern classical architecture. And it was Pugin, the first one, or here, another contrast, the difference between the industrial city and the pre-industrial city. And so Pugin is the first one to look at the past and find a bigger value in past rather than in the present time. And most importantly, he thought that it was the moral values were higher in pre-industrial societies than in modern societies. So he slowly derives these ideas that maybe we should return to some ideals of the pre-industrial society. And these ideas became very, very influential for the contemporaries of Pugin. Now, one of the seminal figures of 19th century was John Ruskin, a theoretician of architecture and generally of society. And John Ruskin is another important figure, and I would again advise you to read further about John Ruskin. He was the first one to notice that industrialization brings division of labor. So, like for example, if in the Middle Ages you were a master of a crafts and you were making a chair and you put your pride inside your product, in the industrial society, you cannot make chair. You simply work in a factory and you produce maybe one part of chair, and another person produces another part of the chair, and the third person assembles the chair. So basically, you are alienated from your work. You simply do one task as a robot mechanically. And John Ruskin was the first one to notice that although it is effective, it is efficient, and it produces surplus, and it produces more and more chairs, more and more clothes, more and more food to satisfy the masses, this division of labor. But it also causes the degradation of the operative into the machine. And so he again contrasts this traditional craftsmanship with labor of mass production, and his famous words, "It is not, truly speaking, the labor that is divided, but the man, divided into mere segments of man, broken into small fragments and crumbs of life, so that all the little piece of intelligence that is left in a man is not enough to make a pin or a nail, but exhausts itself in the making of a point of a pin or the head of a nail." Okay? And this critique of industrial society is very poignant. So he criticizes industrial society not because it creates some metal structures which are not aesthetic, but rather he criticizes the whole basis of the industrial society. And there was plenty, and it was very obvious why we should criticize industrial society, because as I said, industrialization leads to urbanization. And when the farmers and people move into the cities, the only place they can live is in these kind of crammed slums. And we see the gloomy, depressive, smog-filled neighborhoods of 19th century London. And again, you can remember the novels of Charles Dickens and other writers to understand how deep the problem was. So the people did not even breathe air, the disease, the crime, and the abhorrent quality of life, and working for basically like a robot for nothing. So this was one. So John Ruskin starts his critique with this. Well, John Ruskin is a very, very complex figure in 19th century. He becomes one of the mentors of the new generation of artists who call themselves pre-Raphaelites. Now, so this is the famous painting of Raphael, the Madonna with child. And what the new generation of painters think that the Renaissance and then the industrialization brought something not genuine into art. They thought that there was some genuinity lost from the Renaissance all onwards, and following Ruskin's lectures, they believed that they could kind of return to the times before Raphael, the famous Renaissance master. Now, and so this is one of the paintings of a pre-Raphaelite artist, which, sorry, I did not write name on it, but they were very famous people, and sorry, I did not write the names of the artists here, but we see a total contrast where they want to present the tragedy of life in a more direct and honest fashion, the pre-Raphaelites, and John Ruskin was also involved with this group. And another influence that John Ruskin had on the new generation of British uh, intellectuals, architects, designers was this idea of return to the ideas of crafting, that art is not some idealized forms of some ideal beauty, but rather art arises out of honest work, of putting your handwork into the thing you made. And so this is how the most important phenomena of 19th century is being born, which is called arts and crafts movement. Yeah. And one of its most main proponents or representatives is William Morris, another seminal figure. And William Morris was a poet. He was partly an architect, painter, and most importantly, he created objects. And arts and crafts movement, please pay attention to this movement, because it will be very important to this movement when we want to understand Bauhaus, for example, in 20th century, because arts and crafts created the ideals that would be that we will witness even all throughout the 20th century. And so we see how how William Morris's work in the world of design. And I think this is the first time we see the birth of a designer in a contemporary sense, a person who invests his own intellect in producing usable objects and where beauty is part of the usability. So beauty is not just attached to the functional object, but beauty is the necessity of a functional object. And so the object is produced as a huge totality with this woodwork and then work on the fabrics. And we see all these, the works of the first designers, and William Morris was one of these seminal figures. And now William Morris has his classmate, Philip Webb, and so Philip Webb built for Morris the so-called Red House in Bexley Heath. Now this house is considered the first instance of a modern architecture, and you might be surprised, why is this a modern architecture? Because it looks very Gothic in a sense. Why can we say that this architecture is modern? Well, first, this architecture employed local materials, honestly. It avoided the ideals of classical architecture. The second, it tried to fit into the landscape. And now let's contrast what was fashionable back then. So we see these Palladio's villas, and please look at the plan of the villas, how they all follow a very strict mathematical formula. So in Renaissance, Palladio invents the formula for a villa, and the plan is a very, very clear diagram. But look at the plan of Bexley Heath. The plan follows basically the functional requirements. So instead of coming up with a pre-made ideal schema and then trying to fit the function inside the ideal circle, ideal square, the architects of Bexley Hill, Philip Webb, followed the natural flow of function. And the house, the shape of a house, this L shape, is not pre-given. It arises, it emerges out of this function. And then it gives rise to this play of masses again. Instead of having some ideal square with ideal portico, we see that the mass, the main aesthetic impact of this architecture is how it is composed of many different masses that work together to create this dynamic composition. And so arts and crafts architecture is born, which is the, and we see then some other British architects elaborate on these ideas. like Voysey is one of the most important architects of 19th century, him elaborating further this famous English house, or rather the house that follows the traditions and the ideals of arts and crafts. And of course, another important thing is that the interior furniture, wallpapers, and other furnishings were also done by the same designers, by the architects. So we see that this whole, almost the total work of art already arising. So Voysey is another person who continues this tradition of arts and crafts architecture, or Bailey Scott. And I think if we contrast this architecture to classical art, you remember in the first half of our lecture, we saw neoclassical architecture and how different it is from the ideals of neoclassicism. I hope it is very clear that there is a total break with academism in this architecture, and this is why we believe that this break with academism is the starting point of modern thinking. And this is why these buildings are already some kind of precursors to our modern architecture, even of the 20th century. Okay, let's go further. Now, in United States, we have also a very interesting story with arts and crafts. One of the seminal figures of American architecture, the father figure of American architecture, is Henry Hobson Richardson, who also, even though he was educated in arts and in Académie of France, Académie des Beaux-Arts, as you remember, we said, all architects were educated according to academic traditions. But Henry Hobson Richardson creates his own unique local architecture, American architecture, and which is related to these ideals of arts and crafts, and especially, and another architects from United States around the same time is Charles and Henry Green, who worked in California, and we see how they adapted the ideas of this modernity to local, to climate of California, to what California is all about. And so they created the first prototypes of Californian houses. Or Bernard Maybeck, again, who went further to elaborate this language of architecture of wood. And I think if you compare this to classical architecture, you see why we can already start talking about certain kind of sense of modernity. Now, the modernity that does not come from technology. They use natural materials, stone, tiles, wood, but the ideas are already modern. So in order to create modern architecture, you don't need modern materials. You simply need modern ideas. Because you can have a building that employs modern materials that is very, very unmodern. Like like this house we saw, the concrete house. The most interesting figures out of this era was the Charles Rennie Mackintosh, who was from Glasgow, and his wife and his partner were known as the Glasgow Four. I'm sorry I did not write their names in the presentation. And as you see, the Glasgow Four worked in what we today call the design industry. Back then it was not called a design industry because it was not industry actually. It was still rooted in crafts and in local production. Our life. What we see from Mackintoshes is the emergence of, again, these very, very original ideas about lines, shapes, and the most famous Mackintosh chair, which is even today, after almost a century and a half, looks almost done by like yesterday. Now, the buildings of Mackintosh are also interesting in a sense that this Hill House, again, look, one quality we can say is the informality. In contrast to academic formalism, we have this informality where the masses follow the functional requirements. Again, a very modern idea and very important for this asymmetry. Now, asymmetry is not just an ideal, but it's just a result of a logical work. If you work logically on a building, the shape will not be symmetrical. A symmetrical building, you must have obsession of symmetry to get a symmetrical building. And you must even go against function to make a building symmetric. A natural way is to follow the requirements of the site and of the function. And of course, so the hill house, and we see, oh, and the interiors of the hill house, I think, speak for themselves. The interior, you see, made almost a century and a half ago, is totally modern. It is total shift of a paradigm from these painted ceilings, domes, pilasters, Greek references, sculptures. We see this modern, minimalist space where architect designed every single detail filled with light, where geometry, simple geometry, guides us inside, where we can breathe. And the masterpiece of Charles Rennie Mackintosh is the Glasgow School of Art, which today is under renovation. And again, if we probably one of the first examples of this totally new thinking about architecture is this Glasgow School, where we see the employment of these huge window planes that define the volume. And I think this is one of the important innovations, using huge glass surfaces for windows. Right? Although it has its own almost Gothic appeal, but still the modern is unmistakably modern. And so please study this example. Okay, if I had to give you an assignment, Rennie Mackintosh's architecture would be one of the most important case studies you can do for our course. And in interior, we see this, again, the simple usage of simple, honest usage of wood. Okay. Now, we will be, I think, 15 minutes, and we can fit what our lecture in 15 minutes. So this is one tradition. Let's underline. Okay, so what we saw in the beginning of the lecture, we talked about the emergence of the new materials and how architects and engineers face new materials. Then the next chapter was the critique of industrial society and kind of idealization of pre-industrial modes of production, the birth of arts and crafts, and the ideas of arts and crafts suddenly evolved into the architecture of, for example, Charles Rennie Mackintosh. And now we go to our third point, which is another response to modernity of the 19th century. And this figure is Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, which we mentioned last time, and his famous book, Discourse on Architecture, which formulates the fundamental principle of modern architecture, even for the 20th century. It becomes the ideal for the 20th century architects. Now, the book was written around 1872, and let's read that quote. There are two ways of expressing truth in architecture. We must be true according to the program of requirements and true according to the method and means of construction. And so we see how important the concept of truth becomes already in the 19th century. And this is already a different paradigm away from academicism, away from Greek ideal of some abstract beauty, right? This is how it opposes some abstract ideals of some abstract beauty with the idea of truth to requirements and truth to materials and the means of construction. And so Eugène Viollet-le-Duc was also a scholar of architecture. He studied especially Gothic architecture, and he was the first one to understand why Gothic architecture is important, because unlike Renaissance architecture, Gothic architecture follows the logic of means of construction. So the Gothic masters achieved, pushed the stone to its limits but used it in a very logical fashion and created this skeletal figure. And so inspired by, and look, let's remember what Gothic architecture is about. Now, it is not the wall that is bearing the load of the building, but these skeletal elements, like a frame, the idea of a frame that can carry the load of the building. And so Viollet-le-Duc thought, well, now we have a new material, metals. Why cannot we use the principles of Gothic architecture or the truthfulness to construction, to structural logic, to create contemporary buildings? And he leaves us with a couple of drawings. And please observe, we see for the first time, it's like a column, but the column is not forced to stand upright. Because if the column doesn't stand upright, it is a scandal for academic architecture. It's like a murder. If you slant the column, it's like murder of a column. But Viollet-le-Duc realizes that he is not doing columns. The column is not the point of architecture. The point is to create an element that can carry the load. And one way to distribute the load is to use these slanted structures to more effectively distribute the weight of the building. And we see for the first time the experiments with how architecture can employ modern principles of structural logic. And here we see the drawing of a large hall, which again uses the ideals of Gothic architecture, but translates them into the iron construction, iron structure. And so Viollet-le-Duc becomes one of the most influential architects for 19th century architects. And even this drawing even belongs to him, where he tries to find the ways of making metal into an object of beauty, not just an object of load bearing, but also the object of beauty. And we will see how inspired people become from Viollet-le-Duc's ideas. So now we have one tradition is arts and crafts, and another is the rational structuralism of Viollet-le-Duc. And these two strands, arts and crafts plus Viollet-le-Duc, we get a new blend, a new strand of thinking about architecture. And to help us understand this architecture, we can now start with Antoni Gaudí, the famous Catalan architect. And he was very, very much inspired by the ideas of arts and crafts, the ideas of architect as an honest craftsman, and on the other hand, the idea that a building is a rational structure and the structure is the main component of the building. And even one of the earliest works, which is commissioned in 1878, this Mataro Workers Cooperative. And another important thing about this building is that the idea was it had a very social idea behind this project. It was the workers' cooperative. What it means that it was like a social housing where the workers came together to create the common living spaces themselves. So it like empowered the working class of Barcelona's workmen. And so it included 30 houses, a social center, a library, and a school. And so Antoni Gaudí was part of this social awareness of social responsibility of architecture. But another thing interesting to us is look how beautiful this honest structure can become, and how beautifully Gaudí manages in this very utilitarian and simple building to express beautiful structure, not just interior, but how the building works is also translated on one of the elevations of the building. And so these are the beginnings of Antoni Gaudí, which I'm sure you all know. But of course, another thing, Gaudí is a very, very complex individual in history of architecture. Of course, he was bred by arts and crafts, the ideas of structural rationalism, but of course by his own Catalan culture. And Catalan culture was shaped by much more complex blending of various cultures from from Islamic world, from European world. And this is why we see Antoni Gaudi's architecture, on one hand, being very natural. It follows some, it is inspired by nature to create structures, but on the other hand, it is over elaborated by cultural references, because all these colorations, all these weird shapes are also references to cultural values of Catalan region. Now, one important person in Gaudi's life was Güell, and here is Gaudi, here is Güell. He was one of his main commissioners, and Palau Güell is one of the masterpieces of Gaudi. He built it for Güell, and we see again how Gaudi elaborates further his ideas of arts and his own version of arts and crafts and structural rationalism. And what we see here is this peculiar arch. Please pay attention to this arch. Now this arch, you can get this arch if you take a rope, and if you allow the rope to hang from two points, the rope will take the most effective shape. It wants to remain in this shape. This is not a parabola actually, it is a different kind of shape. So what Antoni Gaudi understood is that all you need to do is allow the rope to hang and then take this shape and invert it, and this will be the most effective arch you can get, rather than ideal sphere, circle. And he uses these ideas in his architecture. And again, let's look quickly at some of the works of Gaudi, which is Park Güell, famous Park Güell, where he uses the earthly elements. But he is inspired partly by mythology of his local culture, some ideas of nature, his own unique understanding of what nature is, to come up with these ideas. And here we see his masterpiece. No, this is still Sagrada Familia, part 3. Yes, no, we should write here Sagrada Familia. And here you see how Gaudi came up with the idea of this structure. You see he hung the ropes on 2 points, and the ropes took this natural shape, and then all he had to do was to invert these ropes to get his famous arches, the most effective way to support the roof. But of course, Gaudi is a more controversial figure. Here, we see that it is not a whimsical invention of an architect, but it follows a very clear structural logic. But of course, Gaudi is much more controversial. For example, in Casa Mila, the whole idea of structurality almost disappears, and the building becomes this flowing mass. So Gaudi is one of the first architects who requires a specific approach to understand. And this is another thing I think that will be very important for our 20th century architecture. Suddenly we see a personality, an architect, and to understand this architect, we must study him as a person. We cannot understand Gaudi's architecture just by looking at the ideas of Viollet-le-Duc or the ideas of arts and crafts. We need to understand the culture he was living in, and we need to understand his own personal thought process. And so today, when we try to understand, I don't know, like Peter Eisenman or Zaha Hadid or Frank Gehry, we understand that we need to study their personalities. To understand, for example, Hagia Sophia, or to understand Alaverdi Church, we don't really need to understand the personality who built it, because he was just a master builder. He was following the canons. But here with Gaudi, we see the emergence of a new type of architect, an individual, almost like Piranesi. This is where we can draw some parallels between Gaudi and Piranesi and Ledoux and Boulez, because they, in order to understand them, we need a much more thorough examination of their own characters. And to understand, for example, Casa Balto, we need to understand Gaudi. We also need to understand that maybe he put some metaphorical ideas into this building. The one interpretation is this: see, this roof is definitely a reference to the scale dragon's skin, and we see the cross. And if we if we put dragon plus cross, what do we get? We get Saint George, and we even see all the victims who fell in this fight. So basically, this facade of the building of Casa Balto is a celebration of Saint George, who was the patron saint of Barcelona. Now, sometimes people like to group Antoni Gaudi with the movement that is called Art Nouveau. Now, and there is, so when I said that if we take ideas of Viollet-le-Duc and add the ideas of arts and crafts, we get this new blend, this new synthesis of what is generally called Art Nouveau. Now we go to Belgium, to an architect called Victor Horta, and the building, this seminal building in history of architecture, Hotel Tassel, employed this whole new language of architecture, which later the people started calling it new art or Art Nouveau. In Russian, they call it simply modernism, but it is not the modernism of 20th century. It is a very confusing term. In Italy, it's called style liberty, and so on. In Germany, it was called Jugendstil, but generally, the French name Art Nouveau is much more acceptable, I think. So we see that Victor Horta uses these new materials, the ideas of arts and crafts, and the ideas of Viollet-le-Duc that a metal can express its honestly its structure. And please, let's remember Viollet-le-Duc's these famous sketches, and we see the birth of a new era, which is called Art Nouveau. Using modern materials, but giving them using natural forms to humanize these metal structures. Okay. Now, one inspiration, at the same time, we have the artists like Jan Torop, who again finds new, inspired by interpretation of lines in art. Okay. Now, so the first architect we studied today was Mackintosh. So please write down, take a note of these architects, because we will, these architects are important for our course. So it was Rennie Mackintosh, probably, and Red House was the first example we said. Then there was Rennie Mackintosh. Then we saw Gaudi, and now we are going to Victor Horta, a very important architect for our story. Now his Hotel Solavi elaborates further the language of Art Nouveau. And if you live in Tbilisi, you might recognize this style, because Tbilisi is a city filled with Art Nouveau buildings. Unfortunately, they are in a very bad shape. They need more appreciation. So Art Nouveau was a very short period in history of Western art and architecture. It lasted almost just 20 years. And even by the end of his career, Victor Horta, building his Maison du Peuple, which is considered one of his masterpieces, he simplifies his language, and he gives us a very honest and simple expression of glass structure. And so this building, People's House, which was a headquarters for a political organization, is also considered one of the seminal works of modern architecture. We can already start talking about the modern architecture with this building. Now, as we said, this is Art Nouveau, and usually Hotel Tassel is considered to be the first built examples of Art Nouveau. And again, as I said, it was inspired more or less by rationalism of Viollet-le-Duc and ideas of arts and crafts. And okay, now before we go to further with Art Nouveau, this is we are in Belgium. Let's go to France. Then we'll go to Austria. Now we go for a journey to France, where structuralism was more had much more significance. The theories of Viollet-le-Duc. So this title is not quite correct. The next chapter is not really about Art Nouveau, rather than it is the same period, the end of the 19th century in France. And of course, no, it's still related to Art Nouveau. I'm sorry, I should not have erased this title. So the way the French did the Art Nouveau was much more closer to the structuralist rationalism. Like, for example, again, let's return to this example of Anatole de Bodot's Saint-Jean church, which uses, as I said, reinforced concrete for structure, but some of the elements are quite in relationship to the aesthetics of Art Nouveau. Now, Bodot is an important, another important architect from French Art Nouveau is Hector Guimard. And again, I think you can recognize that this approach to this Art Nouveau approach to the buildings, it has on one hand it has this kind of simplicity, but some tries to achieve beauty through simplicity, but also mixing in some kind of floral inspirations and natural inspirations. So one important, now Hector Guimard's this building is, I think, very interesting for us because he was, I think, the first case where we see the employment of these slanted structural elements to support the weight of the structure. And this building almost looks like the 21st century building if we don't pay attention to the elaboration of the element itself. And Bodot writes that a style of architecture, in order to be true, look, so what was the concern of the 19th century architects is to find a true style for their own times. They believed that the neoclassicism was not did not express the 19th century, and they needed to search something new, and they found it in these expressions. A style of architecture, in order to be true, must be produced of the soil where it exists, of the period which needs it. Now, almost 90% of the architects will sign their names under this statement. All of them adhere to this statement. The principles of the Middle Ages and those of the 19th century added to my doctrine should supply us with a foundation for a French Renaissance and an entirely new style. Let Belgians, the Germans, the English evolve for themselves a national art, and assuredly in so doing they will perform a true, sound, and useful work. And so again, the idea of truthfulness comes up, but in the idea that architecture emerges out of local traditions, out of the local culture and local interpretations is important for Hector Guimard. And Hector Guimard is an architect who seems to have three different approaches. For example, when he builds outside the city, he employs this rustic interpretation of architecture with Mauerlats and like, please look at this building. So he kind of uses this rustic or rural ideas to come up with a structure. Now, when he works in the capital city in Paris, he cleans up the style and it is a bit more formalized, a bit more formal. But then when he works for some light structures, he uses this the language of metal and glass, and probably you will recognize the famous entrances to the Paris metro stations. Again, this is the work of Hector Guimard, our important architect. Now, so again, the honesty, the truthfulness are important, which might seem a bit paradoxical. Are these structures really honest and truthful? But one architect who was really, really truthful and honest is the Dutch architect Hendrik Petrus Berlage. Again, we are dealing with the end of the 19th century. Now we are going to Holland. And this is how he thought. Since architecture is art of spatial enclosure, we must emphasize the architectonic nature of space in both constructive and decorative sense. For this reason, a building should not be considered primary from the outside. Above all, we should show the naked wall in all its simple beauty and scrupulously avoid any tendency towards over-ornateness. Again, what we see here, what is important in Berlage's words is the emphasis on the word space. And I think he is the first architect to underline the importance of space, and that the wall's function is simply to enclose the space, and it should be as simple as possible. And what Berlage does, Berlage is a seminal figure of Dutch modern architecture, and what he does, he looks at the examples of ancient architecture, and he says these are buildings without architecture. They're simply honest expressions of sound structural ideas. Unlike Renaissance architecture, these late medieval architects did not try to invent some fresh and some weird ideas of architecture. They simply did an honest work of enclosing spaces. And so is inspired by Palazzo Pubblico in Siena, by the temple in Modena, and in Pavia, all these Italian examples. And so, okay, so when he builds this building, which is Amsterdam Stock Exchange, another important building for our course, please write it down, note it down. Now, we see that he is inspired by these examples, but he is not inspired by the aesthetics, although it is arguably very much inspired by the aesthetics of these. But more important is that he is inspired by the principle that it is a building, simple wall that just does its job. And the interior, again, we see the interior of Amsterdam Stock Exchange. It's enlarged, this building. Now, I must admit that even for me, this understanding this building is not as simple, because on one hand, it is a almost Romanesque revival. You know what the revival is? So we said that 19th century was obsessed with revivalism, or bringing back to life historic old styles. In one sense, this is more like a Romanesque revival, but if we add the ideas of Berlage, this is why it is still considered a modern idea of architecture. And later in his career, for example, in Kunstmuseum, Berlage simplified his language much further, and I think expressed the modernity. Now, we could attach more importance to this building, but this building was built already in 1931. So by 1931, what we call the modern architecture was already in full swing. So this is not such a surprising building for 1931. But since we are dealing with Berlage, I still included this example. Now let's travel to Vienna, where Art Nouveau found its new life, headquarters. And we can begin with the Vienna group. Well, one important personality in this group was the old architect Otto Wagner, who he will come back to our story. He was an old generation, but the new generation of artists, they wanted to avoid these academies and avoid everything that has been already established by the Viennese bourgeoisie. Okay? They wanted to protest and be against it. And so they seceded from the academy and they founded Secession, or the Viennese Art Nouveau. And there were many artists like Koloman Moser, but one of the most important artists of this period is Gustav Klimt, the painter Gustav Klimt. And I have to, sorry, but we don't have references to art in our lecture. We just talk about architecture. Gustav Klimt and Secession painting deserve a separate lecture, but unfortunately we don't have that much time. Now, what Otto Wagner did, an old architect, he suddenly, around the age of 60, he switched sides and he said that he supported the new generation of these architects, and he suddenly, in 1899, he put a building like this, and which was a whole scandal in Vienna. The building that disobeyed all the classical rules of beauty and which embraced all the inspirations from nature, color, lines that the artists were inspired by. And so this is how Viennese Art Nouveau comes to be with this group of architects, and among them the architect becomes Joseph Maria Olbricht, who built the house for the Secession, their headquarters, so to speak. And we see, I think you see how particularly it has something of still some elements of classical beauty, like the idea of a cornice, of symmetry, of order, but it is a totally different interpretation of architecture. And Olbricht's this building is considered a masterpiece of Viennese Art Nouveau or Secession. Or later in his career, he continued his path towards simplification, and now we see these famous, please pay attention to these pure white walls, which later becomes the hallmark of 20th century modern architecture. But of course, it is 19th century and the architects are still trying to kind of still have some references to the past. Like they want to create their own modern style, but still referencing the past. And this is one thing that probably was very difficult for them to cope with. Another important architect from Viennese Secession is Joseph Hoffmann, whose early work is this building. Like now, this building is clearly very analogous to English houses we saw like a few slides back, these arts and crafts houses, right? But later he changed, he elaborated his position further, and he writes, I am particularly interested in the squares as such, and in the use of black and white as dominant colors, because these clear elements have never appeared in earlier styles. What we see here is the strive for clarity, for simplicity, which also becomes important for future architects. And Hoffmann is another architect who produces not just buildings, but the whole world inside the buildings. What I mean is the furniture. Even look at this very modern looking cutlery. So Joseph Hoffmann becomes, again, like Rennie Mackintosh in Glasgow, Joseph Hoffmann becomes the prototype of a modern designer. And now, in his building, Puckersdorf Sanatorium, I think here, this building, well, the historians of architecture don't attach much importance to this building, but if you look at it, it is 1903, and there is something eerily contemporary about this building, don't you think? Well, one, it does have this symmetry, but besides that, the whole building is reduced to its basic volumes. And the one thing that makes it complex is simply the fenestration. And I think I would like you to think about Joseph Hoffmann's Puckersdorf Sanatorium as one of the first examples of this ideal of simplification in architecture. And then we will draw parallels, because about 10 years later, 15 years later, we will see that the whole world of architecture is overtaken by simple white walls and cubes and shapes. And so Joseph Hoffmann kind of so he still is the architect of Art Nouveau of his own times, but somehow Art Nouveau found a way to simplicity. So it's still a hard building to explain. And look at this pure, clean, almost utilitarian interiors, but which have their own decency, nevertheless. Well, usually Palais d'Oclé is considered more of a masterpiece of Joseph Hoffmann. I'm interested more in this building, and it's up to you to decide. But so Palais d'Oclé, which is uses natural stone, is considered more important achievements of Joseph Hoffmann. But I think here we see the birth of what later would be called Art Deco. Now, Art Deco is something that happens in United States particularly. Some elements we see, so Art Deco again inspired by more or less by Art Nouveau. But this building, I don't really have much to say about this building. It uses a very interesting idea, the highlighting of the edges. Look, which is a very unusual idea for architecture. Now let's return to the old, these are the new generation of architects of Viennese Secession, but the old one is Otto Wagner. Otto Wagner, who by the end of his life embraces fully Art Nouveau, and let's look at some of his buildings, how he embraced the Secession, the youthful culture of Art Nouveau. So Art Nouveau was basically the culture of the youth back then. And the old master, Otto Wagner, starts to interpret the ideas of Art Nouveau. Sometimes you have these kind of eccentric examples, which are more stereotypical images of Art Nouveau. But for example, in his post office, he again purifies the shape, purifies the form. He employs a very interesting strategy for the facade, these points that he uses on the facade. But on the interior, I think the interior is the masterpiece of modern architecture, a very simple, clean room filled with light. And we can remember this example and then draw parallels with Norman Foster. About a century later, we'll see Norman Foster pursuing the same ideals of huge spaces flooded with natural sunlight, glass being the main material to achieve this effect. And even the tiles, if you pay attention to the flooring, are glass material. And a big masterpiece, I think, from Otto Wagner is his second house. He built two villas for himself, and the second villa, I think, is one of the good prototypes for this simple but effective architectural statement. Of course, we see him using these ideas from Art Nouveau, where the facade is also partly is half painting, half building the details. But if we look at the general mass of this building here, look how Wagner manages to purify his architecture and to give it a kind of even monumentality and some simplicity, but not some new idea of structure emerges. Like we see a simple cube where the simple rhythm of windows is enough to give us the idea, to communicate us the idea of basic architectural ideas. So I think this villa is another interesting prototype for this white architecture. And again, as I said, these are some examples of Art Nouveau in Tbilisi. What happened to Art Nouveau? What happened to this generation of architects? Well, what happened is the World War I. And I think maybe, arguably, one thing that totally destroyed the old world and brought another new revolution, new world, is around the time of 1910s, where we see the Great War, the first industrialized war in Europe, which saw mass murder, which saw the usage of technology for genocide, for the purposes of genocide, and we see the ideas of efficacy, of efficiency employed for destructive purposes. And all of the ideals of these young architects who pursued Art Nouveau went to hell, went to ashes. And after that, we will see next time the revolutions in Russia, in Germany, and the emergence of a totally new ideals in architecture, with not new ideals, but again rethinking the industrial heritage for architecture. So we can now end our lecture on 19th century with this with this with this point in history of architecture. So I think our lecture was, I understand that it was too long, and I see some of you have left. I think we can stop our lecture today.